skill development. Um, First, I want to talk about a few resources that we have in the skill development folder. Um, so I've got notes from grad school on Develis. So you're probably getting a newer version, so some of this may be a little off, but this might be helpful. I also put my slides from our skill development class in case that's helpful. This is an article by Roger Worthington in TCP. It's a little dated, but a lot of these norms are somewhat current, and it definitely gives a good sense of just an overview of the process of skill development. And then I have a few example publications where we did skill development. So yeah. So first, why bother with developing scales? So we talked about this a little bit at our first meeting, but it's good for your career to know how to publish a measurement paper. One reason is measurement papers are among the most highly cited articles, and also it allows you to evaluate new theories and new constructs that haven't been studied before. And another aspect is a lot of theories of intervention imply certain mechanisms, and so this basically allows you to evaluate mechanisms of an intervention. Okay, so what I did here, and this was based on steps from Dr. Worthington's course, and he structured his course based on the Develis text, but it describes the different steps in the process. So I'm going to go through each of these in these slides, but this is a general overview of the entire process. Okay. So number one, first step, determine that you actually need a new measure. It takes a lot of work to go through the whole process of developing a scale, and so one of the first things you want to think about is how are you going to justify why you created a new measure, and it's probably worth getting some strong feedback from people who have done scale development before on whether your rationale for creating a measure makes sense. So doing a systematic review and kind of finding all other measures and seeing what your competition is. And if there are other measures of the construct, thinking about how you're going to show evidence that your scale is better in some way. And oftentimes this has to do with showing incremental predictive validity, showing that you can predict something above and beyond the other scale. Okay, number two, creating a conceptual definition. So this is a critical step. I've always said definitions are the fountainhead of knowledge. Oftentimes in literatures, when there are disagreements, you can often trace these disagreements back to fundamental differerences in definitions, and definitions directly have implications for measurement strategies. So a lot of the work that goes into developing a strong measure actually happens at the conceptual level. And we're going to practice that with several of the new measures that we're trying to develop, and you'll get a sense of what that's like. But it involves not just kind of taking a dictionary definition, but kind of working a definition forward so that it implies specific things psychologically. So for example, it implies things about how stable the construct may be over time, whether it's happening inside of a person or it has more to do with interpersonal behavior, et cetera, et cetera. Number three, describe content domains. So, say you're looking at a measure of like relationship satisfaction, you may kind of focus on three or four different domains in which you might expect to see signals of high relationship quality, and sample items from those different domains. So it's essentially a carryover of your definition, and you're making sure to be really clear the domains in which you're going to sample items. And then in each of those domains, you're thinking through different ways that the construct may manifest psychologically. So in thought, emotion, behavior, motivation, etc. Then you're going to select an item format, and when we're together, we may talk a little more about that. DeVellis kind of goes through some of the different styles. The most common is a Likert scale. And number 6, you're going to create the items and then evaluate the quality of those items. So most of what we're going to do is probably drawing a classical measurement theory. DeVellis kind of describes some of the technical elements of this, but kind of practically speaking, some of what this means is you're generally assuming that the items are each indicators of a latent construct, and so in theory they're each doing an equally good job of kind of assessing this latent construct. So if the construct is something like love, you might have one item that says, I really like to spend time with him or her. I would do anything for him or her. And so in theory, each of these items, the underlying construct of love is causing how people respond to those different items. So it's important to kind of start this process with a general sense of how scale development works. So once we did this once or twice, I had a better sense of why some scales may kind of fall apart. So you generally need items that are going to correlate really strongly with each other based on this assumption. And you need to have enough items on each subscale. So oftentimes if you don't have at least 3 items on a subscale, then it's hard to get a sufficient alpha. Ken also mentions identification for doing the CFA. In terms of just statistically, EFA almost always works. It's a little bit like a Ouija board. It is going to find something. The bigger issue is, does it replicate well? And my mentor, at one point he mentioned that like 1 out of 2, maybe only 1 out of 3 papers that they tried to develop a scale ended up replicating well. So it turns out I've had a lot more success than that, and I think one of the reasons why is we figured out why the RMSEA was having a problem. So that's one of the indications of fit when you go to do a confirmatory factor analysis, and we'll talk about that later. But it actually penalizes you if several of your items correlate too strongly with each other. And how that can happen is if you word the items very, very similarly, they might correlate more strongly than they should, just based on the latent construct causing responses. So what we do now is we actually have a way of kind of identifying items that are too strongly correlated with each other. I'll talk more about that later, but bottom line is the more you understand about where your scale may kind of struggle and even fail, you can design the items and kind of anticipate those things to give it a better chance of performing well. And then lastly, there's issues of thinking about whether your scale is going to have incremental predictive validity relative to other measures and what that might take. So in terms of selecting items, one thing to think about is content validity and whether you've kind of sampled the full breadth of the construct. So when you're looking through items, just kind of checking on that, make sure you have a balance of positive and negative wording. You need at least 3 to 4 items per subdomain. At this stage, redundancy is okay. So you can later on kind of cut out redundant items like we talked about. And a good rule of thumb is to create maybe 3 to 4 times as many items as you hope to have on the final version. Some clearly bad items, I give some examples. So if the wording's unclear, a mismatch in the reading level, double-barreled items, and I give an example, and unambiguous pronoun references or other ambiguities in the writing, and we give a memorable example. So oftentimes a good process is to have expert reviewers give you feedback on the items, and oftentimes we'll actually write up a definition and ask for feedback on that definition, and then have reviewers rate each item as it in terms of its relevance to that definition, and also allow them to make suggestions to clarify items or add new items. And sometimes we'll do that within our team, and then also send it to several actual experts who have published quite a bit in the area. Step 7 is you give your items to an initial pilot sample. This would be a smaller sample, and that's just to kind of get any feedback about the readability, clarity. If it can save you some time and heartache if you kind of learn early on that there may be problems with some of your items. Okay, so steps 8 through 13, those have to do with kind of giving your items to an initial couple of samples to do the factor analyses. And so we're going to talk about these steps. We're going to kind of break these parts up over the next several months, and we're going to start with an EFA. But generally speaking, people do this different ways, and even within my papers, you can kind of see a few different ways that I've done this. But I'm going to give you a general outline for what this could involve. So in study 1, you give an initial set of items and do EFA to refine the items and finalize the scale. Then in study 2, you replicate the factor structure. So you kind of overfit things to one sample, and you cut items based on the characteristics of that sample. So you're wanting to see if the factor structure replicates. And then in study 3, oftentimes you'll evaluate evidence of construct validity, and we'll talk more about this later, but the short version is you're looking at correlations and the pattern of correlations, and based on theory, you want to show that your construct is strongly related to things that it should be, and that it's also moderately or even weakly related to things that it should be. So you're looking for just a pattern of correlations that make sense. So for example, with a measure of forgiveness, it would make sense if that was strongly related, strongly and negatively related to something like anger. And then for the 4th study, That's to publish a skill development paper at a strong journal outlet. Oftentimes, you need kind of a capstone study that really showcases the measure. So you could have like a difficult to get sample, like a community sample that really shows evidence of validity for the measure. If it could be that you show really strong evidence of criterion validity or do some sort of sophisticated design, longitudinal design, where you show that the measure is useful in some way. But bottom line is the first three steps are fairly straightforward, and then oftentimes you want to kind of provide a fourth study that is a little bit of a capstone, kind of icing on the cake.